All right. Good evening. My name is Susan Derwin, and I'm the director of the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center. On behalf of the center and UCSB's writing program, which is our co-sponsor of tonight's event, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this year's Diana and Simon Raab Writer-in-Residence Public Reading. The Writer-in-Residence program was founded in the spirit of Diana Raab's accomplishments. Diana is an award-winning writer. She has published 9 books, including 4 poetry collections and 2 memoirs, and over 1,000 articles and poems. Diana is also a prolific blogger and public speaker, and recently she earned her PhD in psychology with a dissertation that focused on the healing and transformative powers of writing. Her latest book, Writing for Bliss, a 7-step plan for telling your story and transforming your life, offers detailed lessons about literary technique and practical exercises designed to place the tools of narrative into the hands of her readers. The book is also a moving account of the creation and sharing of personal narratives, and Diana regularly leads writing workshops to help others write their stories as well. The UCSB Writer-in-Residence program was inspired by Diana's own experience in an MFA program that brought in professional writers to speak about their craft. These meetings were important to Diana's development as a writer, and so, taking our cue from her experience, our writers-in-residence also visit writing classes to speak with students about their writing process. So we feel very fortunate to be able to offer this program, and I'd like to ask Diana now to stand so that we may extend our thanks to her. Thank you so much. This year's Diana and Simon Raab Writer-in-Residence is Helen Macdonald. Voila. Helen Macdonald was educated at Cambridge University, and from 2004 through 2007 was a research fellow at Jesus College, Cambridge. Currently, she's an affiliated research scholar in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science at Cambridge. She has also worked as a professional falconer and raptor conservationist, and she has bred falcons for one of the royal families of the United Arab Emirates. Macdonald has written and narrated radio programs, and she appeared in the BBC4 documentary series, Birds Britannia. Last year, an episode of BBC's Natural World series followed her while she was training a goshawk chick. Macdonald's books include Shaler's Fish, Falcon, and of course, the memoir H is for Hawk, which recounts Macdonald's response to her father's sudden death when she retreats from the world, falling back on the one sure thing she knows, falconry. A longtime falconer, she decides to raise and train a young goshawk. H is for Hawk has been a bestseller since it appeared, and critics have loved it. Writing in The New Yorker, Catherine Schultz stated that the book was perhaps the finest nonfiction she had read in the past year. New York Times critic Dwight Garner wrote that it was, quote, so good that at times it hurt me to read it. In 2014, the memoir was awarded the Samuel Johnson Prize for Nonfiction and the Costa Book Award. One of the Costa judges described the book as, quote, wonderful, muscular, precise, scalpel-like prose that wove everything together. Indeed, the prose is a weaving together of everything. It is because in her grief, everything, Macdonald and the world, falls apart. At one point, Macdonald even loses her ability to lose language. I had forgotten how to speak, she writes. My mouth makes small, mumbled assurances to the hawk that all was well. Everything falls apart in this book, and everything is put back together. Gradually, as Macdonald emerges from her grief, language returns. H is for hawk. Letters form words, and words conjure worlds. Macdonald brings herself back into life as a namer of worlds. Italo Calvino has said that, quote, a classic is a book that has never finished saying what it has to say. And I think that H is for Hawk is such a classic. It will never finish what it has to say because it gives the reader an experience of nothing less than the creation of the self through the discovery or rediscovery of the world. and this experience is bound to last long after the final pages of the book have been read. Please join me in welcoming Helen Macdonald.
That was the nicest introduction I have ever had. And now I feel like I can't possibly live up to any of those words. Thank you so much. And thank you to Diana and your husband. Thank you for this writing residence. It's just a joy to be here. When I walked out into the campus for the first time of the day and I saw the lagoon, I was furious with you all. How come it's so beautiful? Okay, so what I'm going to do today is a few things. I think most of the talk will be about this book because it's kind of well known. I'm going to read a poem that I wrote. And to start with, I'm going to just read a bit of, this is very new. It's something I'm writing for the New York Times Magazine at the moment. Year before last, I went on a trip to Chile with some space scientists. It was unbelievably cool. I mean, it was freezing. It was like 15,000 feet. My sleeping bag, you know, comes that time in the night when you're like, I need to answer a call of nature. It's minus 16. It was intimidating. And it was extraordinary. And these guys are up there testing out techniques and equipment for future Mars rovers, and I was accompanying them. So I'm going to read a couple of bits about how weird it was up there. It was weird. On my phone, how modern am I? The landscapes here are vast, astonishingly beautiful, and potentially dangerous. There are volcanoes everywhere. They've instilled in me an oddly eschatological mindset. At night in my sleeping bag, I woozily speculate on the meaning of life and death, the fate of Earth, the end of things. All things seem possible here. In the minibus the next morning, Pablo and I joke about finding alien artifacts. If you're going to find something like that, it'll be up here for sure, he says. It's extraordinary, this light, this otherworldly light, like everything shines from within. Heaven tipping down in miles of ultraviolet. I ask Mario, the expedition doctor, if déjà vu is a recognized symptom of altitude. Absolutely, he says. I'm relieved. It keeps happening. It's starting to scare me. Yesterday, a llama sheltering from the wind behind an outcrop stepped down with leisurely, measured grace across talc-dusted slabs. I knew I'd seen it before, more than twice, perhaps 5 times, 6. I knew I hadn't, of course, but these mirrored recollections were instantly telescoped and pleated together like a pack of cards, all of the same suit, flicked through with a thumb. More and more, there's a sense that reality is unreliable here, as if I could put a hand to the air and it could slip right through to another universe if I wasn't paying sufficient attention or paying too much. As if I could free together another reality by rubbing corners of air together, like you're trying to open a recalcitrant plastic bag. And the wind pours on us as we drive, making dust devils spin over the distances, all outside, seemingly inimical to breath. Oh, it's exciting. It really was weird. And the great thing is of being at that altitude for so long, when I came back to England, I felt like a god. It was great. Okay, a quick poem. This is one called Mir. These were poems written when I was a Callow undergraduate. I confess I was very miserable. I wore black a lot. I wore black more than I do now. I was basically an emo before there were emos. But I love writing poetry, and I like writing complicated poetry that no one understood, including me. But this one kind of does have some sense to it. It's called Mir, which is, engineers speak for Mishap Identification Report, and also the name of the Russian space station, which fell to Earth. A fragment of paint, a carrying bolt Dera had missed, and the threat of rain so prolonged that the dictation of miracles was abandoned. These simplicities were useless to me, though war was all there was to see, scat and hesitancy, the brilliance of a star, the sapphire's boxed array, the cobra beside the stone. And all I saw was the naught on the scales as the snake moved, not the crowns, nor the pigeon-egg diamond in the hilt of a vizier's armory, the lock of hair, or the hand of bronze to kiss. Gosh, I'm really nervous today. What is it about this? What is it about you, crowd? Never break at the middle of I once went to a poetry reading where some poet was reading stuff out, like this. And this hand went up, and someone said, "Sorry, what did that last line mean?" He was not impressed. Okay, back to the poem. The lock of hair or the hand of bronze to kiss, only egrets, white through lignite and soft hydrocarbons, and each wing a scant line of cartilage broken into ribs of light and shade. Every time the line progressed like silk, iron deer, tin diamond, and blue sky over top carpy, dismembering the fortuity of travel one stop and bracketing. This was the world as it existed for our amusement. Satisfaction snipped from empirical brochures entire. Ginza, Hadramaut, Nazca in 6x4, milled, screened, and bleached to cuttle ink by months of sun and wind. There are 12, including the pyramids, the tower in Paris, the bowed milk of the opera house, and the silver heaped about Bilbao, the thin crenellations of a wall about hills, and the lights of a city west of an inland sea. No distinction is offered. These are tokens only. Your farewell is only the cuttings looking at me. Their derivation is both more than ours and lessening, the marketable and the promise of these cities both. Either could be plain. Though bells are ringing, it is only the changes they're practicing, fringes meshing into an airy October night. And overhead, a point of light travelling away from the setting sun, the falling station describing its sear arc before it passes behind clouds and enters the shadow of the world. I haven't read a poem for ages. Really nervous. I think it's a university setting, you know. It's bringing back academic fears. Okay, this is a book about a miserable woman, a dead author, and a bird. Trying to sell this was kind of hard. It's not a book that's like, I was sad, I got a cat, I was happy again. It's kind of more complicated than that. So what I'm going to do is basically tell the story, but do some readings from it. I'll try and calm down. I don't know. And basically, I'm not going to talk about one strand of the book, which if you read it, you know is about the writer T.H. White, an extraordinary writer, a very troubled man, who himself tried to train a goshawk in 1936 and made a terrible job of it. This book is not just me saying, I can train a goshawk, and he couldn't. It's kind of more complicated. We'll talk about how he and I made the same mistake, basically. We saw the goshawks as a mirror of our own selves, of our own needs, and that's something we do to the natural world all the time. So the book really started, 10 years ago now. March the 21st, I got a phone call from my mum, and she said to me this phrase. She just said, I had a phone call from St. Thomas's Hospital. And there was this long pause, and I knew my father had died, and I found out at that point why people say, are you sitting down when you give them bad news? Because I fell to the ground, my knee stopped working. He was a very sudden death, he had a heart attack. He was a lovely man, my friend as well as my father. We were both, what's the right word? You don't say anoraks here, do you? Geeks? Nerds? Yeah. We were kind of nerds. He was an aeroplane nerd, I was a bird nerd. We kind of, we got on. You just need binoculars for both of those things. So, and he collected books. He was self-taught. He was a photographer, press photographer. And I was talking about at lunch, actually. One day he brought back, I was in my 30s at this point, actually, a book called The Nymphal Stages of Sahelian Grasshoppers. And I was like, oh, come on, Dad. Like, come on, not even Sahelian grasshoppers, it's the nymphal stages. And he looked at me and he was a little bit hurt. And I opened the book and it was full of the most exquisite watercolors of creatures I didn't know existed. And I was kind of, okay, he kind of knew what was good about the world. But he died, and I fell apart. It was the first big loss of my life. I thought I was doing fine. I had a really inadvisable love affair. It was terrible, but predictable. And my grief was sort of going on. It was raining, and then this thing happened. I began to dream about goshawks. This is not normal. I haven't met anyone else who's ever had this response to losing a parent, but I did. And one in particular, years ago, before then, I'd been working in this falconry centre in Britain in a place called the Forest of Dean. Actually, it's a very weird place. It's an ancient forest where there are wild boar and American skunks. No one knows how they got there, but they live and breed in the Forest of Dean. It's very odd. While I was working there, a wild goshawk flew into a tree and knocked herself out. This happens. Goshawks they go into kind of berserker mode when they're hunting things, like heat-seeking missiles, and sometimes there's something in the way, and they'll kill themselves, I mean, it's kind of admirable and stupid at the same time, their commitment to what they're doing. This one hit a tree, knocked herself out, woman walking her dog, had found it and thought, oh, there's a dead bird. And she picked it up and it moved. She put it in a box and brought it to this centre, and this was the hawk that I dreamt about. We congregated in a darkened room with a box on the table, and the boss reached her gloved left hand inside. A short scuffle, and then out into the gloom, her grey crest raised and her barred chest feathers puffed up into a meringue of aggression and fear, came a huge old female goshawk. Old because her feet were gnarled and dusty, her eyes a deep fiery orange, and she was beautiful. Beautiful like a granite cliff or a thundercloud. She completely filled the room. She had a massive back of sun-bleached grey feathers, was as muscled as a pit bull, and intimidating as hell, even to staff who spent their days tending eagles. So wild and spooky and reptilian. Carefully, we fanned her. I'm doing it again. This can happen a lot. I tend to do the movements. So there'll be flapping arms. I'm sorry about that. This is kind of what happens if you think you're a hawk for a while. You end up still flapping your wings and your arms. We fanned her great broad wings as she snaked her neck round to stare at us unblinking. We ran our fingers along the narrow bones of her wings and shoulders to check nothing was broken. We checked her collarbone, her thick, scaled legs and toes, and inch-long black talons. Her vision seemed fine. We held a finger in front of each hot eye in turn. Snap, snap, her beak went. And then she turned her head to stare right at me, locked her eyes on mine down her curved black beak, black pupils fixed. And then, right then, it occurred to me that this goshawk was bigger than me and more important, and much, much older. A dinosaur pulled from the forest of Dean. There was a distinct prehistoric scent to her feathers. It caught in my nose, peppery, rusty as storm rain. Nothing was wrong with her at all. We took her outside and let her go. She opened her wings and in a second was gone. She disappeared over a hedge, slantwise into nothing. It was as if she'd found a rent in the damp Gloucestershire air and slipped through it. And that was the moment I kept recalling over and over. That was the recurring dream. And from then on, the hawk was inevitable. It was always the hawk that caught me. It wasn't the other way around. So I'm going to talk about obsessions for a bit. Did any of you have obsessions when you were young? Dinosaurs, volcanoes, matching card things. My niece Amy was obsessed with Minecraft, and I think Taylor Swift. These are quite normal obsessions. Mine wasn't. All my friends were obsessed with kind of pop stars and had pictures of pop stars on their bedroom walls, and I had photographs of kestrels. I was totally obsessed with birds of prey. I mean, it was just embarrassing. This is an emotionally open book, but there's only one thing I really regret putting in it, and it's that when I was small, I tried to sleep with my arms behind my back like wings. I've said it again now, I had this kind of slightly religious fervour about hawks. I just loved everything about them. And then I discovered there was still a thing called falconry, and that was it. My mother and father were like, Mum, Dad, I'm going to be a falconer. And they were really good about it. I think about twice my mum said, are you sure you wouldn't rather be a lawyer? Doctor? No. So, that's how it happened. And I became a falconer, and for many years I flew many different kinds of birds of prey. I learned that falconry was a very intimate and astonishingly, I think, enlightened relationship between a person and an animal. There's no coercion or force involved. It's a mutual respect. They can always fly away. But there was always one bird I never, ever, ever, ever wanted to fly or train or be near, and you can guess what that was, right? It was a goshawk. They had this reputation. And I've spent a long time trying to get across what a goshawk is to sort of general audiences. And I tried initially to use military airplane metaphors, kind of like Apache helicopter gunships, but that doesn't wash with everyone. And I finally hit on it. Goshawks are the Christopher Walkens of the bird world. They're kind of psychopathic, kind of murderous, kind of weird. Anyway, I thought this was great until I went to a place in Connecticut, and I gave a talk, and I said that, and there was this dead silence. And I'm thinking, does no one here know who Christopher Walken is? That's very odd. So I gave the talk. And then afterwards, I came up saying, you do know he lives here, don't you? He's a very nice man. He's not a psychopath. It's like, I'm sorry. So that was quite stressful. But yeah, they have this reputation as being murderous killers, and there's a bit in the book where I talk about how when I was younger, a guy told me he flew a goshawk and explained that if a goshawk is unhappy or behaviorally sort of acting up, the way to cure that is to let the bird kill as much as possible. And I'm like, oh, security, that's kind of weird. But then my father died, and they were all I could think about. And I did something which sounds a lot worse than it was. I bought a goshawk on the internet. It wasn't Craigslist. It was a goshawk breeder I knew in Belfast who was an extraordinarily good guy. And suddenly I discovered myself on a quayside in Stranraer in Scotland. It was like a drugs deal. I had £800 in my pocket, a can of Red Bull. I was chain smoking at the time, pacing up and down the quayside in this port that was kind of like a gun-running port. And I saw this man coming towards me with these boxes, and I met Mabel for the first time. I'm going to talk a bit about what I'm trying to do in the book here, which I don't normally do. This bit, when I see Mabel for the first time, I'm going to stop pacing up and down. What I'm trying to do in this section is to take you, without realizing, take the reader from my eyes into the hawk's eyes, which is kind of what happens in the book in a more general sense, and also to try and describe her and fail over and over again. This is a real purple prose, but nothing no way of describing her really captured what it was like to see this bird in the flesh. Let me find the page. So we had to check her band number. It's all very highly regulated, goshawk breeding and keeping. Another hinge of the box untied. Concentration, infinite caution, daylight irrigating the box. Scratching talons, another thump, and another thump. The air turns syrupy, slow, flecked with dust, the last few seconds before a battle. And with the last bow pulled free, he reached inside, and amidst a whirring, chaotic clatter of wings and feet and talons and a high-pitched twittering, and it's all happening at once, the man pulls an enormous hawk out of the box, and in a strange coincidence of world and deed, a great flood of sunlight drenches us, and everything is brilliance and fury. The hawk's wings barred and beating, the sharp fingers of her dark-tipped primaries cutting the air, her feathers raised like the scattered quills of a fretful porpentine. Stole that from Hamlet. Two enormous eyes. My heart jumps sideways. She is a conjuring trick, a reptile, a fallen angel, a griffin from the pages of an illuminated bestiary, something bright and distant like gold falling through water, a broken marionette of wings, legs, and light-splashed feathers. She's wearing jesses, and the man is holding them. And for one awful long moment, she's hanging her head downward, wings open like a turkey in a butcher's shop, only her head is turned right way up, and she is seeing more than she has ever seen before in her whole short life. Her world was an aviary, no larger than a living room, and then it was a box. But now it's this. She can see everything. The point source glitter on the waves, a diving cormorant 100 yards out, pigment flakes under wax on the lines of parked cars, far hills and the heather on them, and miles of sky where the sun spreads on dust and water, and illegible things moving in it that are white scraps of gulls. Everything is startling and new stamped on her entirely astonished brain. So I brought the hawk back home and then began the ancient dance. Thank you. What was really handy about the situation was I knew I couldn't tame grief. You can't tame grief. It is enormously powerful. But I knew I could tame a hawk. And something about the wildness of grief within me trying with the wildness of the hawk. There was some way in which I was trying to sort of fix myself. I knew I could train hawks and tame them. I knew I could do this. And it's a process that involves you kind of disappearing from yourself. You don't think about yourself. All that there is for you is the hawk. And it's done in this kind of really medieval, kind of monkish way. You withdraw from the world into your house. You draw the curtains. You tell your friends to leave you alone. It's brilliant when you're miserable. And you sit there with this hawk who was scared of me. She was a baby, right? And I was this kind of monster. And slowly as the days go by, through gifts of raw steak and quail and other expensive food items, she began to feed from my hand, and then she began to like me because every time I appeared, I had food for her. This works with all sorts of things. And then I would ask her to fly to me on a line, inside and then outside. And eventually when I called her, if she flew 50 yards to my fist instantly, it was time to take away all of the contraptions and fly her completely free. Big deal for someone who has some issues with loss, okay? But before that, I had to go and get her used to people, and this was hilarious. Have any of you been to Cambridge in England? Yes. It's a very eccentric place, but there are limits. So in Cambridge, it's fine to walk around speaking Latin and wearing kind of tweed with holes in. That's fine. But you try walking around with a hawk on your hand. I remember vividly, small boys would run past shouting, "Harry Potter!" at me. And I get really angry and shout at them, "It's not an owl, it's a goshawk." The pedantry of grief. And then even worse, kind of, because I'm kind of get bird used to people and stuff, and I'd see kind of kids come up and very curiously look at her, and then hands on their shoulders would bring them back, and they'd hear their voice, "Don't go near the hawk lady, dear." It was odd. But eventually, Mabel, as I called her, became super, super tame. And we had this excellent life. So I think my goshawk was watch more programs about moving house and buying antiques than any goshawk in the history of the world. I called her Mabel because it's Latin for amabilis, meaning lovable or dear, which is kind of ironic because she was a goshawk. And there's a kind of tradition in falconry that if you give a goshawk a name like Killer, it will just do nothing and sit on the floor and squeak like a mouse. So I have a friend with a goshawk called Bunty and one with a goshawk called Baby Doll. Even he thinks that's awful and calls her BD for short. So Mabel it was. And Mabel was playful. All the things that I've been told about goshawks being these merciless killers seemed to be a bit off. I'd end up scrunching balls of paper and throw them to her. She'd throw them back to me. Stuff like that. And I told my goshawker friends about this and they were horrified. They were like, "You don't play with goshawks." And later I discovered that they all do. They just don't want to let on about it. More about masculinity than goshawks there, I think. So there was this one time when I'm walking around the town, and things become strange to me. The things it's my normal neighborhood. There's kind of, buses and cars and stoplights. And I'm kind of start to look at them and I'm thinking, what's that for? Like, I'm starting to take on some of the hawk's perception of the world around us. And the hawk isn't really bothered by anything. Buses will go past her. She's like, whatever. And there's this one time when she looked up and a pigeon was flying down to roost in a tree. And everything about the hawk changed. She sort of went like this. Fluffy, 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 fluffy. Oh no, I can't believe I'm doing this. It's being videoed as well. So she's kind of fluffy, and then she saw the pigeon. And it was like, she was in assault mode. It was terrifying. She became this completely other thing. And then I had this realization that I kind of should have thought about before. And that was, I thought the hawk represented life. She was this vital, living creature who lived in the present, didn't have a past. But I forgot that they were one of nature's most predatory animals. They kill stuff. That's what they do. And I knew that I would go hunting with this bird because I think if you keep hawks that are predatory, not letting them do that is kind of just cutting off half their behavior repertoire. It just seems really, really cruel. And so I started to take her hunting, and that was possibly the weirdest experience of my life, even more weird than the deja vu in Chile. Because every time I went out with her and she started flying around the landscape, I saw the world a different way. And to university audiences, I generally would say that it was kind of like taking a lot of drugs. Not that I know what that's like. It was psychedelic. Everything that I saw became infinitely detailed. Things lost their names. I began to see the world in this ecstatic way, but only when the hawk was flying. When I came home, I was miserable as hell. And I would do stuff like, I'd wake up in the morning, my pillow would be soaking wet, and I'd be like, I must have an eye disease. Not, I've been crying all night, which would be the obvious thing to think. And I got more and more like my hawk. There was this point where the mailman knocked on the door, and I hid behind the sofa. This is not what I used to do normally. So basically, I was assuming upon myself the characteristics of my hawk, because I wanted to be that hawk so badly. She was solitary, she was self-possessed, she was powerful, she didn't experience any human emotions, she didn't experience grief. And I kind of took it too far. I went kind of bonkers. And it was a very strange kind of depression because it was very beautiful. My world was full of color and light and wind and snow and frost and movement. But I was feeling nothing unless I was out with a hawk. And yeah, it was very, very odd. I didn't realize how miserable I was. And it was kind of dark because, of course, the hawk was killing animals, because that's what hawks do. And I had to run in and dispatch these creatures before the hawk, because hawks just basically start eating when they catch things. There's no reason for them to sort of be, kindly and put them out of their misery. So there I was, sort of running around, feeling great about life, and murdering rabbits and pheasants. It's just not brilliant. And it wasn't until I went to my father's memorial service that I realized what I'd done, and that was basically I'd bought into that old chestnut that nature will heal all wounds, that this infinite place of solace, an infinite, it would just fix anything. And I'd just taken it too far. I think there's a grain of truth in that, but not the way I did it. I went full feral. And I realized that I was kind of really depressed. Really depressed. So I went to the doctors. That was hilarious. I'm going to read this bit. I have scared myself. I go to the doctor. I drive to the surgery with no hope of rescue, but I can't think of anything else to do. The doctor is a man I've not seen before. He's small, dark-haired, with a neat beard, red braces, and a crumpled cotton shirt. Dr. Stewart, if anyone's in Cambridge. He sits behind a wooden desk. Hello, he says. Take a seat. I sit in a chair. I look at the desk. It is oak. I think of winter trees. What seems to be the trouble, he says. I say, I think I might be depressed. Some things have happened over the last few months. My father died. I'm so sorry, he says. Then I tell him I've got no job anymore and no money coming in and no house either. I didn't mention the hawk once. And I did a talk once and a woman put her hand up and said, hello, I'm a psychoanalyst. I said, oh no. She said, why didn't you tell the doctor about the hawk? It was the most important thing in your life. And I thought about this, and I think it was because genuinely at that point I wasn't sure there was any difference between me and the bird. We were kind of the same thing in my head, which is kind of testament to how strange things were for me. And I tell the doctor this thing, and he gives me this, it's kind of a questionnaire about, I don't know whether that happens in America, I'm not sure, but you get a questionnaire about mood, and it's like a kind of multiple choice, like at school. And I remember sitting there, and there's this moment I just can never forget. One of the questions was, do you feel you are taking less care of your personal appearance than formerly? And I remember thinking, I don't know. And I looked down, and seriously, guys, I hadn't washed my hair for a month. I had scars and scratches all over me from thorns. I had rabbit blood on my trousers and holes in my t-shirt. And I was thinking, I don't know. Anyway, yeah, I wasn't taking as much care of my personal appearance. So antidepressants, I mean, I want to talk about this because, there's a lot of discussion about ways of dealing with this. I think at the point that I went on to antidepressants, I think that I was already so aware of how lost I was that it was a way back. But also I was trying very hard to reconnect with friends at that point. They forgave me for my total absence, which was amazing. Most of them, no, all of them. And I kept flying the hawk. And it was a very, very interesting experience. The more I flew the hawk in this very strange kind of getting better state, there was this moment one morning when I knew things would be okay. I was looking out of the window, and every morning I'd look out the window with the hawk and think, like, what's the weather going to be like? It's like kind of aviators. Is it going to rain? Is a front coming in? And I remember looking out the window one morning and looking at the sky, and it was a sort of very strange, pewtery, high cloud, wintry cloud. And I thought, oh, that looks really pretty. And I hadn't had any kind of feeling like that for so long that I knew that things were going to change. So the big mistake that I'd made was to see Mabel as me. I'd seen Mabel as a mirror of my grief, when what Mabel was an astonishing other bird, right? She was a bird, she had different understandings of the world from me, different visions of the world from me, and it wasn't until I realized that I realized what a gift she was, despite having such a different understanding of the world, such a different phenomenal view. We had a relationship. We genuinely did. I mean, obviously not a dubious one. I mean, we really were friends. And I'm going to just end by, how long have we got? I'm going to end by reading this bit here, which is kind of my revelation, which has to happen in books. Of all the lessons I've learned in my months with Mabel, this is the greatest of all. There is a world of things out there, rocks and trees and stones and grass, and all the things that crawl and run and fly. They are all things in themselves, but we make them sensible to us by giving them meanings that shore up our own view of the world. In my time with Mabel, I've learned how you feel more human once you have known, even in your imagination, what it is like to be not. And I have learned too the danger that comes in mistaking the wildness we give a thing for the wildness that animates it. Goshawks are things of death and blood and gore, but they are not excuses for atrocities. Their inhumanity is not to be treasured, is to be treasured, because what they do has nothing to do with us at all. And the more I think about this, the more I realize that the great revelation that I had wasn't just that if you look after grief, it will turn to love after a long time. And you don't get over grief, you just become a person that can hold it within you. But that whole experience with the hawk, I know that lessons is a kind of a strange thing to say about this experience, but it taught me to love the world more. It made me softer. The very fact that I was seeing life and death really close up with the hawk made me realize how short all our lives are and how precious they are. It's very strange. And when I look at a landscape now, it's not just a picture. I just think of all the millions of lives that are there, even the tiny ones. So in a very weird way, grief and this experience with a hawk has made me value life much more than I did before, which is kind of weird. And that's kind of it. So if we want to talk about questions afterwards, just go for it. Quiz me. Thank you very much. Go on, be cruel.
We have mics set up, so come to the front and ask your questions, please. Don't be shy.
I had a small boy once who stood up and said, "What was the biggest thing Mabel ever murdered?" My first thought was, why, you're 5 years old, what are you doing here? And then I said, rabbit, and he just looked disgusted. And I said, what did you think? He went, oh, what did you think? And he went, a horse? And I shouldn't probably tell this because someone might, if we record, but I remember one man once said to me, he was very cross, and he said, "Why did you get a hawk after your father died when you could have had a baby?" I know, I laughed out loud. It's a bit irresponsible, I think. But any questions apart from those two, I'm really welcome.
I'll start with the So, when did you know you wanted to write about this experience?
That's a really good question. It took a while. So even towards the end of that year with the hawk, after I'd sort of come back from the very dark place I'd been in, I realized there was a story there that was much older than me, a bit like goshawks. It was a story about a trip to the underworld and back, in a way. It was a story about getting lost and coming home. And I was really interested in how old and stark the shape of it was. But it took me a very long time to realize that I could sit down and write it. So it took me 4.5 years before I thought, I'm going to do this. Because the more distant I got from it, the more it seemed to me that it wasn't just a story about me. It was a story about, the world, really. That sounds really kind of, up myself, but it was a big story, and it was much, much bigger than me. So I thought I'd give it a go. And by sort of 5 years, the person that was in the book was sufficiently distant from me that I could treat her as a character. Because she's an idiot. If you read the book, you're like, oh, come on. I mean, at points I was writing it, and I was like, oh, I can't believe I did that. And when I finished the book, I didn't think the book was going to be grief work, but when I finished it, there was this extraordinary moment when I felt almost like I was going to be ill. I was going to faint. And I realized that the book was a goodbye not just to my dad, but to the person I'd been back then, who was very naive, very self-centered. And I think grief does make you very self-centered because, you're hurting. But I'm glad I'm not her anymore. She's a nightmare.
So thank you so much. And this is in some ways a follow-on, but I think, Susan, you said that one of the critics said how painful this book was to read. Mm-hmm. And so if you could talk about a bit more of your experience writing something that painful to read. Yeah,
it's funny. The bits with the hawk were really easy. I sort of got into that kind of like, I'm with the muse. I'm going to ecstatically write down what it was like to watch her fly. Writing about me was hard, and writing about my dad was even harder. And I rewrote those many, many times. It was a bit like chipping away at a big mound of marble until you reach the stuff inside. It was a lot of work to get the simplicity of honesty there. It was very strange. I'm saying today to some really nice students that when I started the book, I was much more British. I thought, I'm going to just talk about the bird, really. I'm not really going to talk about me. And I kept writing the first 2 chapters. It was like hitting a brick wall again and again and again. And I realized that, it's a disservice to the reader. If you dissemble like that, if you're not emotionally honest in a memoir, there's no point in writing it. And as soon as I started to sort of become really Californian, that's a kind of British joke. We just know you guys are really cool. As soon as I became Californian, it really started to flow. And that was just astonishing, that sense of resistance that I had before, because the book wouldn't let me do what I thought I was going to do. It said no. And the more you write the book, the more it becomes this kind of weird creature that's almost alive. There are times when I tried to get chapters in that book that wouldn't go. And I found myself writing something else. I'm like, whoa. It was really weird, that sense that they can push back. And it's a very odd experience writing it.
Thank you for a really interesting talk, and I really look forward to reading the book. I actually
I've given away the ending now, haven't I? That's terrible. I'm so sorry. Spoilers.
I lost my mother 10 years ago, and I imagine there's probably something in there that I'll connect with.
I'm so sorry. It's really hard.
Thank you.
It's hard.
But I'm just curious, I apologize to ask a question about sort of literary things, but I've been reading just a little bit about Japanese falconry recently, and I actually, many years ago when I visited Cardiff Castle, I noticed they have an active muse.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious, how are you involved in falconry? What kinds of things? Do you train lots of other birds? What else are you involved with?
Yeah, that's a good, no one's ever asked me that before, actually, so thank you. Japanese falconry is really interesting. This is just a sidebar, but in medieval Europe, you can sit down, it's fine. In medieval Europe, the kings, the really high status birds were falcons because you need a lot of land to fly them. And commoners just didn't have the availability. So the big falcons, gerfalcons, peregrine falcons. In Japan, where the terrain was very different, the elite bird was the goshawk. And I don't know if you've seen, there are those exquisite wall paintings and panels of Japanese goshawk paintings. And if you haven't seen them, hit Google, they're incredible. Me and falconry, I don't have time to keep a hawk now. I think that it's a huge responsibility. You need to fly them every day you can. So, I'm kind of not doing much falconry. There are some exceptional falconers here. I like American falconry much better than falconry in Britain. In America, falconry is very heavily regulated, and you have to pass exams. You have to have inspections. It's all sorts of stuff. In Britain, anyone can just go out and buy a golden eagle. There's absolutely no restrictions, and that's led to some serious problems. And one of the things I was worried about was when this book became popular, I'm like, oh my God, people are going to want to keep goshawks. But luckily, I made it sound so miserable and difficult that it hasn't happened. So, thank you. Sorry.
Hi, no. Maybe sort of building off of that, I was wondering, since one of my favorite things was talking about the play with Mabel and how that was something that seemed surprising, but then you just mentioned that other falconers were playing covertly with their birds too. If you could say more about the different types of play that other, falcons and falconers had invented separately, like you had the ball kind of back and forth. So what,
they
what did
didn't really
do?
let on. Usually with predatory animals, a goshawk's a bit like a cat in the sense that if you sort of jerk something around, it will kind of get really excited. With my parrot, for example, if I do that, it just looks at me like, what are you doing? You have to be kind of predatory to have that kind of cue. So most of the things that falconers would do if they're playing with goshawks would involve just throwing things that they catch, tennis balls and stuff like that. But I think, that story tells much more about, two things really. It talks about the kinds of acceptable things you're allowed to do if you're a male falconer, right? You don't play with your hawks, they're like feathered shotguns. That's really mean, I didn't mean it. But more so I think it's really illuminating because it bespeaks what we do to animals all the time. We flatten them, we make them represent things, just as medieval bestiaries made them represent things. And goshawks generally represent secretive, murderous ghosts, not things that play. So I think that was the big lesson there. That if you one of the great things about being able to interact with wild animals, actually interact with them rather than see them on TV or through the kind of glass screen of binoculars, is that they're incredibly idiosyncratic. No two goshawks are the same personalities. And just knowing that makes the world bigger. You know, I don't know if you could say the same about ants probably, but most animals, they're not just type specimens of a species, they have individual personalities, and that's just glorious, you know. The world is full of minds that aren't ours, it's wonderful. Sorry, I've got just more water.
I mean, this is written in sort of a memoir format, but
Yeah.
you said that you only really felt that you could start writing it once you approached it as something bigger and other than yourself.
Yeah.
Was that true all throughout the writing process, that the writing of it was easier or better when you thought of it not as, you know, the memoir
That's really,
project?
These are like the best questions. I'm really quite on the spot here now. Okay, so the impulse to write was the sense that the story was an old one, one that was bigger than me. When I started writing it, sorry, I'm touching my microphone. When I started writing it, I really discovered I had to be true to my feelings, my remembered feelings at the time, in order to make the book work. The strangest thing was, as I said a little bit earlier, that as the book went on, the main conversation I was having was not with the idea of a story or with myself as a character, it was with the actual book. I mean, it's just the weirdest experience I've ever had. And the writing process became something quite hard to describe, but it was like I knew where I was going to go because I had to listen to what the book was telling me. And I edited fiercely as I went, like I didn't draft and then do another draft. I mean, the book was incremental, and it took a year and a half. And there's one chapter that just wouldn't go in, eventually had to fall out. But that sense of when you're writing a big thing, listening to what the book is telling you to do is such a weird experience. But most of the writers I know say that, and they say that there's always a point when you write a big book where you think this is literally the worst piece of dreck that anyone has ever written. There's no value to it whatsoever. And those two things sort of work. Anyway, that was a really good question. I hope I answered it to some extent.
I wanted to ask you a question about Mabel and where she came from. And I was astonished when you said that in the book at the beginning that all the goshawks had been killed off by hunters.
Yeah.
And so they had to be reintroduced into England. So it's just amazing that happened, or we would not be sitting here tonight listening to the story.
Oh, it's a really interesting story, actually. So goshawks, they were native British birds, and they got wiped out by, in the 19th century in particular. They, from being falconers' birds in the 16th and 17th century, suddenly they were vermin because they were killing pheasants and the things that were kind of the elite hunting. So they were competition. And they got wiped out, and then in the 1960s, British falconers saw what Americans were doing. Because Tom Cade and the Peregrine Fund were reintroducing the peregrine falcon to America after the DDT crisis. They were breeding them in captivity, and they were releasing them. And the British falconers didn't want to ally themselves with any conservation organization, because that's kind of, they're kind of quite a rough lot. And they're like, we're just going to do it ourselves. We're going to reintroduce goshawks. They should be here. And so what they would do is they would order goshawks from gamekeepers in Sweden, where the birds were still being killed, and Germany, and they would bring in 2 goshawks for the price of 1. This is what they joke, buy one, set one free. And they'd set one free. And it's been extraordinary. All the birds in Britain now are the progeny of birds that were released by falconers. It's an extraordinarily homegrown, under-the-radar reintroduction. It's extraordinary, Hello.
I wanted to ask a question about one other relation in the book, which is with the book of T.H. White.
Yes.
I mean,
good.
it seems, when you were speaking to him about also trying to listen to what your book was bringing you and telling you, it seems that in the book there's also this very intense relation with this other, not just author, but book and set of experiences. And I'm wondering about that relation also, partly for the way it augments the story, but also what does it do for the grief?
Yeah.
Is it a companion? Is it a
That's
deferral?
interesting.
Is it
Okay, for the grief, the only thing that I've heard that struck with the force of revealed truth is going to sound really bonkers, but it was a review by a very good writer, and she said that T.H. White is the shade that has to accompany you when you go to the underworld, because if you don't have a shade with your side, you won't be able to get back. And I was like, oh my God, yes, of course that's what he was doing. He was a companion on this journey. I mean, apart from, also obviously he was making the same mistakes that I was doing, and it was a very tragic thing. You know, he had this hawk, he wanted to love it, he hated it, he didn't love himself. It was like him fighting himself in a mirror, basically, him training this hawk. And it ended tragically, of course. He engineered the bird's escape and the bird would have died. He was a haunting. He was a real haunting. When I didn't think there'd be so much of him in the book, and I went to the Harry Ransom Centre, which I kept calling the Harry Ramsden Centre, and it's a chain of fish and chip shops in Britain. It was very, very... and I opened these... he was very, very prolific. He just used to write to himself and write these diaries. And his handwriting was so easy to read, yes. Just like the big deal. And in these books, they were incredibly poignant and evocative. They were full of things that he'd stuck in, like feathers and claws and things he'd found. And there was one page I remember where I actually cried. He had this dog called Brownie. It was his favourite, the love of his life he described this dog as. It was an Irish setter. That lovely, rich mahogany red. And she died, and he was broken, and he cut a lock of her hair and tied it with a red ribbon and put it in this book and wrote a poem for Brownie, and all around the page, you could see he's just been weeping onto the page. I mean, he was so present. So I just brought more of him into the book. I'm going to say something I haven't actually really gone on. I met a woman called Josie, who was someone who nearly married him and decided not to in the last minute for reasons. But was very good friends with him, and she lives in the cottage where T.H. White trained that goshawk, and I visited her. It was astonishing. She's so cool. She's like really old now, very elderly, and she survives basically, as far as I can see, on whiskey and cigarettes. I loved her so much. She does the Times crossword every morning, just fills it out like that. Super brainy, super sharp. And she said, I read your book, and I thought it was very clever, the bit at the end where you say that you saw, the man in the garden. And I said, Josie, I did see a man in the garden. And she went, no, you didn't. And I said, no, I did. I came to the house to see it, and there was a man, this is T.H. White's house where he trained the goshawk. There was a man in the garden digging in the flower beds. And she went, no, there wasn't. We had this big argument. And she was absolutely adamant that there was no one that would have been doing that. And then she went very quiet. And I was like, oh my God, she thinks it was a ghost. And that really spooked me. So that person at the end that I was convinced was T.H. White, I don't even want to know, but she was really freaked out. So I'm going to be like her when I'm old. I loved her so much. She said to me, do you go to America? I said, yes. She goes, oh, good, bring me back some cigarettes. She was excellent. Do we have any more questions? Yeah, hi.
Thank you so much for that lovely presentation.
It's a pleasure. I'm sorry my voice was wobbly. I was really nervous in front of you guys.
It's lovely to read a nice text, but it's also nice to get a lovely presentation.
Thank you.
So thank you for that. My question follows up on Julie's, actually. So I was really struck not only by the T.H. White inclusion, but this overwhelming gesture of loneliness that seems to bond the two of you.
Mm-hmm.
And even tonight you talked about falconry as something that is both intimate, but simultaneously a gesture of failure, right, in terms of both of your experiences. So the first part of the question is perhaps maybe if you could talk more to us about this idea of loneliness that accompanies grief, but also the writing process, authorship, all of these things. And then perhaps if you could speak a little bit more about what about White actually stuck out for you in terms of I'm sure there's a canon of falconry narratives that you could have selected. But is there something about the sort of queer invocation of loneliness for him that was really resonant for you?
I'm not sure where to go about the loneliness thing. So I think the line that captures that for me best is one I put in the book, and it's the Marianne Moore line, which is solitude is a cure for loneliness. And then there's a loneliness of grief, which is one thing, but the loneliness of the writer is certainly another. And I've been a solitudinous person for many years, and I mean, not to kind of rest everything in my upbringing in my early life, but I think the loss of a twin at birth has a lot to do with that, the sense of loneliness that I've carried with me since I was very small. As to the T.H. White thing, was there anything in particular? I think the sense of great unhappiness and the escape, the running away from an untenable situation to try and fix that with a hawk. The sexuality thing, not so much. I mean, he grew up at a time, obviously, you know, being queer was like unbelievably difficult for him, and I think he struggled with that hugely. I mean, I'm bi, but that's not really kind of an issue for me. I don't think I have the shame associated with that. But I think he is so brutally honest in his book. It's a book about someone who is trying to do something and he doesn't know how to do it, and he confesses that, and that's so rare. And in falconry books, it's unheard of. You know, falconry books are all by bluff English sportsmen wearing tweed saying, this is how you do it. It's the only way that you can do it. And this is how the empires run, you know. And there's something about this voice, this T.H. White's voice, which is very hopeful and honest and candid and wrong, and is very aware of being wrong, that I just thought was astonishing. And I still do. He would have hated me, and I would have hated him, you know. He didn't think women should vote. We were subhuman, you know. But enough of him haunted me that I just couldn't not put him in the book. He, for me, is, sorry, I'm going to stop in a minute, but I get very moved by T.H. White. He is a man, I think, whose story is instructive, partly because it shows that even with the best intentions, if you don't have the tools to know how to love yourself, you can inflict terrible harm and terrible injury on others without even knowing you're doing it. And that seems to me, particularly today, a really, really crucial thing to reflect upon. Yeah. Oh, poor T.H. White. Ghastly man. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your
Pleasure.
Enjoyed it a lot. And a question I had, I'm not familiar with the technique behind writing books, but in your novel, I sense there are many stories. There is the story of your grief, the story of T.H. White, there is your father's story, there is Mabel's story,
Yeah.
and at the same time you have plenty of characters.
Yes.
And sometimes these stories feel like characters too. So my question is, like, how do you manage to balance that in a way that it doesn't become overwhelming for the reader? Because it didn't feel overwhelming, but obviously...
I don't know is the answer. I honestly don't know. Wow, that's a lovely observation. Thank you very much for it. I don't know. I do think that this is the only book I'm ever going to write that would work like that. I think it's going to be a struggle to write all the others. Something happened when I was grieving to my power of recollection. I remember everything that happened that year very clearly. So when I was writing about myself and writing about it, everything had the kind of force of novelty to me. I remembered everything so clearly. So it's the sense that when I wrote the book, the things that I thought and the things that occurred to me and the things that I thought of really did happen consecutively. It was a kind of coming to understand things. So that even though the stories are all different, there's a sense that I'm going somewhere. So I sort of do this. But I also, the reason I wanted lots of stories and lots of voices in it, I was discussing this today earlier. Books about nature tend to be singular consciousness, singular people walking around looking at the world and saying, that's a small lousewort, and then explaining what a small lousewort is and saying, basically, aren't you lucky to have me to explain this to you? And I think that's a really interesting voice. It's a very authoritative voice about how to write about nature. And it's very beguiling, and of course, part of me wants to write like that. And I thought, no, there's more than one way to think about the natural world, and I wanted there to be more than one voice in my book for precisely that reason, to make it more complicated. And one of the things that grief does is it sort of shatters the stories you tell about the world. It makes them all break. So I wanted the book to have bits that kind of argue with each other as well. Having said that, I don't know. I don't know how I did it. There was a lot of weeping. I was saying earlier there's a great moment when my editor rang and it was like 6 months late. He was on the telephone and I hid under my desk. It's a very, very sanifying process writing a book. Well, it's been really fun.
You got time for one more?
Yes, please do.
I first became
get some water.
interested in falconry when I read, as a very young boy, I read a book called My Side of the Mountain.
That book is amazing.
Okay, I wanted to know if you'd read it. And it's also about, for those of you who don't know, it's about a young boy who escapes a difficult situation and has a hawk as a friend.
Yeah.
I guess my other question for you is, can you tell us a little bit about what you're writing now, what your current projects are, and where you're going? And thank you again for the book.
Yes, thank you. That was great. My Side of the Mountain, I'm sure most of you have heard of this book, if not read it. It's amazing. It's so empowering. It's basically the opposite of most stories about people in the wildlife. This kid, again, problem at home, runs away to the Catskills. He has like, $10 and a pocket knife and a book on, he's read a book on like survival from the library. It's all very kind of, and he's fine. He has a great time. He has a falcon he trains. He eats well. He lives in a hickory. I mean, it's just like the most utopian book about the natural world ever. Read it. It's brilliant. Where are we going next? What am I doing now? I'm panicking because I have a piece for the New York Times that needs to be edited tomorrow. Rewritten, I mean. They're amazing to work for. The magazine is the most extraordinary bunch of people. And I'm working on a book of essays, which is going to contain a lot of stuff that I've done that has been published before, but also new stuff. And I am hoping to write a book on Midway Island, albatrosses, and the end of the world. Another cheerful subject. So I'm hoping to get to Midway and see this extraordinary, I don't know if you've heard, it's this tiny spot in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Obviously a huge military history, but it's like 2 square miles and it's got like 2.1 million albatrosses on it. And one of them is 68 years old. She's been coming back ever since the 50s. And if you're going to write about guilt and environmentalism, you've got to write about albatrosses, what else is there? So very exciting. I'm terrified, but I think being terrified of a project is the only way to start it. So wish me luck. Thank you so much. I've had such a nice evening. Thank you.